All right, let's get started. It's the Japan Zoominar from UC San Diego. It is December 15th, 2025, and which makes it December 16th, 2025 in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu over there, and good evening, good afternoon on this side of the pond. Today's topic is Japan's new economic security agenda and emerging regional leadership. I'm Ulrike Schade, professor and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology here at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. And today I have two guests, and unfortunately Sheila Smith cannot join us due to a urgent family situation. So we are going to take the brackets off that title and focus today on Japan's new economic security agenda with Michael Beeman and Patty McLachlan. I'll introduce them momentarily. Let me tell you a little bit about GPS. GPS is a School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have two main degree programs, including a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization and a Master of Public Policy. JFIT is our Japan Center, and we do a lot of fun things. You can follow us at jfit.ucsd.edu. And this Zoomina is JFIT's main activity. You can follow us and watch recorded events on the JZ Gallery or on our YouTube channel. I'm happy to announce that our past recordings have now attracted over 80,000 YouTube views, which is quite the number. We have upcoming events, so I had a little bit of hiatus as I was in Japan this fall. Upcoming in January, we'll start with Robbie Feldman, who will introduce his thoughts on the Japanese economy in 2026, and he's actually quite positive. Celeste Arrington will follow in February, the topic on Japan and South Korea. She's got a new book. And then Max Salmon on Japan's whiskey industry, followed by Jim Ramo from Princeton, who's doing some very interesting work on demographic change, and he'll focus not on aging, but on some other things like family formation and so forth and so on. All right, with that, let me introduce my two co-panelists here, Patty and Michael. Hello to Washington, D.C. and Austin, Texas. All right, I'm going to introduce Patty first. Patty McLachlan is a professor of government and Asian studies and the Mitsubishi Heavy Industry professor in Japan studies or Japanese studies at the Department of Government at the University of Texas in Austin. Patty earned her BA and MA at the UBC in Vancouver, where she hails from, and her PhD from Columbia University in Political Science with Professor Jerry Curtis. She has written four books by my count, might be five, and many papers on Japan's civil society, postal politics, and agricultural reform, which is what she's going to talk about today. And Patty, I also want to take this opportunity to thank you for your long service to the field as a committee member at the U.S.-Japan Friendship Commission, the Japan Foundation, and editorial board of the Journal of Japanese Studies. So thank you for all of that. That's really
Thank you.
important
That's
work.
very kind of you.
And then Michael Beeman is, and I'm quote from LinkedIn, Michael, author, lecturer, and former senior U.S. trade official. Michael earned his BA from SMU and his MA from SAIS, which is our competitor at Johns Hopkins. You're forgiven, Michael, because you did this at a time when we were just a tiny little startup here at GPS. Michael also has earned his PhD from Oxford. With that great education, joined the USTR and spent a total, and I'm cutting it a little bit short here, Michael, if that's okay, 16 years off between, as assistant U.S. trade representative for Japan, Korea, and APAC between the years 2004 and 2013. So cutting across many different administrations, our government lately, Michael has been a lecturer at Stanford University and at our very own GPS, where he taught a terrific class on how to be a trade negotiator. Michael has also, and this is important, I think, for today, written a book fabulously titled Walking Out, which really shows how the current U.S. trade situation has been 30 years in the making in terms of the United States undermining the very system and international trade order that it built. So thank you both for joining me. It's really great to have you. So with Sheila out, we're a little bit more focusing on economic security. And folks, if you're totally bummed out about this, sorry. I promise to try to bring her back when her situation resolves. The topic is motivated, yeah, by the obvious fact that the United States is now an unreliable partner in world affairs. And so the question is, what does Japan do with this new uncertainty? And this brings to the fore trade dependencies. And the question is whether this is a moment of opportunity for Japan to shape the region to its interests and how. And we want to look at that from the perspectives of trade, food and agriculture and in my case the business thing. So let's start with a go around on a simple question. So from your vantage point, whether that's a USDR or agricultural reform, from your vantage point on security issues, what are Japan's biggest challenges right now? And maybe Patty, I can give the microphone to you first.
Sure, thank you, Ulrike. And it's a pleasure being here. It's a pleasure seeing Michael again. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So, in response to your question, today I plan to talk a little bit about food security and Japan's participation in global supply chains through trade, etc. And I'd say that the biggest challenges that it faces on that score are threefold. The first two are pertaining to Japanese domestic agriculture, and I'm going to demonstrate how demographic decline shapes food security, or not in some cases, and also domestic politics has a really big impact on food security, and not in a good way. And I'm also going to point out that in the trade realm, Japan is facing increasing competition from China, and that's making it more difficult to achieve some of Japan's food security goals. So that would be my answer to your question.
All right, Michael.
Well, great. Well, thank you as well. It's great to have two strong oak trees on either side of me to hold me up here. And just to build on your point, Ulrike, I think 2025 really the biggest challenge Japan faced was managing its relationship with the United States, just a full-on, kind of new wave of challenges from the second Trump administration, and to try and stabilize and manage that relationship. I think for 2026, and we're seeing this across many countries and in many different contexts, and this is kind of the hardest challenge, I think, for Japan is going to be navigating and maintaining its essential security interests amid this squeeze that the US and China are putting on Japan and many other countries. Of course, it's not like Japan is going to choose China in this. It's difficult enough to manage relations with the US, but Japan is on a particular side. I think we know that. But in order to manage the pressures that are coming as both are asserting their own interests, the pressure is going to be on Japan to navigate its own relationships with other countries that are also under similar pressures and facing similar choices to make, and also managing the risk that the US and China may go off and cut a deal or deals or understandings, whatever word you want to use, that may squeeze Japan out of its own security interests or perceived security interests, either because the US has failed to really give adequate consideration to those interests, or maybe even in ways that perhaps directly undermine Japan's interests. So I think being on guard and being prepared and trying to work to skillfully navigate this situation is going to be the biggest challenge for 2026.
Great. Yeah, and I would add to that, I think the selling out to the US interests in the name of the security umbrella is, from what I picked up, one of the big balancing acts. So I'm particularly concerned right now that Japan has allowed activist investors and private equity funds to start roaming through Japanese companies, and that has taken on a form that I'm a little bit concerned about. So we're going to come back to this question of challenges or what Japan can do at the very end. So here's how we structured our thing today. Each of us are going to take about 10 minutes to talk about their various areas, and it's been determined by my two colleagues here that I should go first, which makes me a little bit nervous, but okay, so you guys can relax. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I saw in the business realm in terms of economic security when I spent some time in Japan in October. And my view may be a little bit biased by the fact that I was there the week before President Trump visited, so everybody was talking about that visit. So maybe I'll have to, shave off a little bit of that. But let me report what I took away from my conversations with people at the ministries and in Kazumi Nagasaki and also in Nagatacho. So my observation was that in the realm of business, um, that at least at that time, the U.S. was like the bullseye of Japan's, dart chart. That as Japan was kind of making sure that the darts were sharp, the centerpiece was really the United States. Takaichi-san's, Prime Minister Takaichi's right-hand person on economic security is a METI official with deep expertise in U.S.-Japan relations. He spent 6 years as a JETRO person in New York, and the entire staff around that is very much a U.S. staff. That doesn't mean that there's no China people, but there's a lot of the economic security policy making part is um, looking straight at the United States, given America's increasing um, unreliability. And the term there is collaboration. It's all framed around how can we appease, how can we collaborate. And what I was told is, I said, see, look, the Japan is 100% dependent on America for the security umbrella. That's a fact. We cannot make America angry. It's not possible. So therefore, we will collaborate. So I'll give you some examples of how that played out. The second top item is the resilience of the supply chains. And there are two interesting aspects of this. Within METI, there is now a bureau office, whatever, a division, no, not a subdivision called the Supply Chain Kyojin Kashitsu. Okay, and the English of that is the Supply Chain Resilience Department. I had to look up that country. Kyojin is actually not resilience. It's very interesting. So it means tenacity or being tough and strong. Kyo is tsuyoi and jin is jintai no jin, so ligament, right? So it's the tenacity bureau, which I thought was very, very interesting. And that bureau is very much looking at China. And there, the label is indispensability. So how can Japan have a strategy play whereby the dependencies on, for instance, rare earth materials, that's a fact. It cannot be changed. It has to be managed, right? So the management comes in by way of Japan developing more and more technologies that are indispensable to China or America or anybody else, and therefore become these chips in the trade negotiations going forward. And what struck me there, and Michael, I'll be curious to hear your take on this, but what struck me there was that while the US seems to be changing tariffs at a whim, today it's 15, tomorrow it's 50, Japan, like China, is building out a long-term strategy on how to deal with this. And I'm wondering to what extent this is new or the same as it was 20 years ago, but clearly there's a strategic preparation around how to deal with dependencies and indispensabilities. So the challenge is the security umbrella, which makes these negotiations so delicate for Japan. And so that makes Japan sometimes patient, sometimes biting their tongue admirably, just being sitting quiet and smiling, and sometimes perhaps foolishly catering to America's preferences, which I think is the squeeze maybe that Michael you're thinking about, especially when it comes to the economy, like enabling activist investors to come to Japan or private equity funds to buy out good Japanese companies. So if you look from scans from the distance, you might sometimes think that Japan is still America's kabanmochi, right? Briefcase carrier, doormat. That would be wrong. So the point I want to make here is that Japan may look like that sometimes and sitting quietly or smiling, but don't be fooled. There's a strategy underlying this. So let me give you two examples of how that plays out. The first is this $550 billion US Japan MOC, which I believe has been a little bit misrepresented by some of my colleagues and commentators on this. And MOC stands for Memorandum of Collaboration. And if you read the fine print, there's absolutely nothing in this MOC that commits Japan to anything. Uh, that would not be in Japan's interest. Now, Japan is very, very interested in doing this, but it would be investments that play into this collaboration and indispensability goal, right? And it's in a way, it's set up very smartly in a way that would ultimately, I think, benefit Japanese business at least as much as American business. The other example of this, new tenacity building Japan are the many trade agreements that we already know about that Japan has been forging for the last 20 years. And one of the goals with these trade agreements, in my view, studying Japanese companies, is to protect the global production network that Japanese companies have built over the last 40 years. According to my data, which are survey-based data, so give or take, but the growth rate in Japanese foreign sales has been 8% CAGR over the last 20 years. So GDP in Japan is flat. Sales abroad have been growing at 8%. Today, some 60% of profits earned by Japan's listed companies are generated outside of Japan. Right? So Japan is ubiquitous in Southeast Asia. There are some 40,000 Japanese residents in Singapore. Japanese banks own about half of the small and medium-sized banks in Indonesia. There's a very interesting thing happening in Southeast Asia that I think American observers are overlooking. And then, of course, there's the whole India thing, which we can also throw in the mix. So all of this is a long-term strategy for Japan to increase Japan's foothold in the region from a business perspective. So I'll stop here. So from the point of view of Japanese business and economy, I think the current moment is critical in terms of global and regional leadership. And these technological dependencies are being built with an eye to create this indispensability, and that in the business realm that translates back into supporting innovation and technology R&D in Japan to create these indispensabilities. So let me stop with that and see what you all have to say and response. I think, Michael, you want to go next on that?
Sure. Do you want me to come back to you, or do you want me to?
Go.
Okay, go. Okay.
Whatever you want to do.
Okay. I'll weave in a couple of responses as I kind of go through what I had to laid out to say. It's a year seems like a long time ago now when 2025 began. And I don't think Japan fully understood or itself appreciated just how much of a dramatic change in it was going to be seeing under the second Trump administration. Compared to the first one, I think there was hope that it was going to be they could recreate the Trump Abe magic and manage things and things would be on an even keel. But the reality, of course, which I knew very well, having been served in the U.S. government during the first 4 years of the first Trump administration, was that there was a lot that was actually considered and thought about and weighed that wasn't pursued or was only partly pursued. Because there were more guardrails, to be frank, back in the first Trump administration. There was a Republican Congress that was much more of a traditional Republican ilk. You had, I think, much more diversity in the cabinet in terms of kind of perspectives on the world. And now you have a different situation there. And certainly you also have the added winning the popular vote in the sense of a mandate to govern and to go all in and full on, if you will. So a lot of those kind of hesitancies or guardrails that were in place the first administration really were unleashed, if you will, or unbuckled. And so I think Japan faced this wave, this wash, if you will, of pressure. My personal prediction for 2025, which I didn't really feel appropriate to say at the time, was that Prime Minister Ishiba wasn't going to make it. And my strong guess as to why he wasn't going to make it was going to be because somehow, some way, these pressures would make it very difficult for there to be enough confidence in Japan that he was skillfully and able to manage this relationship with the United States that somehow is going to come down to some lack of ability to recreate the Abe magic. Essentially, regardless of who the person was, it was always going to be a really, really difficult job to do that. So I think that added to his departure. I don't think it was the sole reason, certainly, but I think it did show the magnitude of this change and how Japan really has had to adjust to a really new Trump administration that's not exactly the same as the first Trump administration in many, many ways. So here's the reality. So to the squeeze, right? The reality is that Japan is still very economically reliant on China. It's still Japan's number one or number two trading partner, depending on which year and which category we're talking about, exports or imports. But the other reality is that there's a lot of fault lines that Japan has with China in many different areas, on trade, of course, on technology, export controls and export concerns, investment issues, conflict over islands and maritime borders, which are enormous. The issue of Taiwan, regional influence and competition vis-a-vis other parts of Asia, history, and so on and on and on. And there's only a certain amount that Japan, I think, can do to manage this with China. And it seems like, success comes typically in the form of just not provoking China or creating some kind of crisis that undermines stability. Just trying to maintain stability seems like the most that you can kind of hope for to have a relationship with China. And that's not just for Japan. I think it's for a lot of countries, to be honest. But the squeeze comes when, China and the US are pursuing, their own agendas. And there's no doubt that Japan's agenda, even under the second Trump administration, is more in line with the United States, but certainly not exclusively so because of the America First approach and policy. So what I'd like to focus on here a little bit is the challenge in managing the US side of this ledger, in order to because that's really where Japan has more flexibility to work through the squeeze that is on a lot of different countries. And my argument is that Japan really has had to kind of adapt and really needs to continue to adapt and demonstrate itself to be what I call an embedded ally. What is that? I don't mean to create a whole new term or whatever, but something that's not a contractual ally to the United States. And in many ways, Japan really is already that kind of ally, but it's coming at this relationship with a very different perspective from Washington about what kind of relationship Washington wants to forge a true friendly relationship. My colleagues here will know I've spoken a lot about zero-sum thinking and what that means. It means if you win, then I lose. That's the basic point of zero-sum thinking. And it manifests itself in a focus that you see in the Trump administration on numbers, measurable things like a golf scorecard, like the trade deficit or defense spending burden sharing as a percentage of GDP, or investment, concrete investment pledges, as you mentioned, Ulrike, numbers that you can use to score on a zero-sum scale who's winning and losing, essentially. And so the challenge for Japan and for others that are trying to navigate the relationship with the U.S. to make sure that their interests are included somehow in U.S. approach is to bring an additive contribution to the U.S. Contribution to U.S. economic security and U.S. national and defense security. So it's kind of flipping to be honest, if we just think about the last 60 years or even 10 years, mutually beneficial relations, alliance with the U.S. and Japan has always been seen through the idea of common values and common interests, mutual interests, shared values, all of the above. That is not enough. In fact, that is actually the kind of language that the U.S. administration that has gotten Canada in trouble, that has gotten Europe in trouble, because it is not presented as feeding into the U.S. interest. Even we all know, I think, naturally that the mutual interest is in the U.S. national interest, and having friends and allies is important. And I firmly believe that as well. But that's really not quite the perspective that this administration brings to its relationships. And it brings a much more, people call it transactional. I prefer zero sum. But it's really showing that Japan is embedded in such a way that it's not only indispensable, but that it's actually consciously focused on contributing to U.S. success, wherever that is. And that is kind of the mindset that the Japanese negotiators and others are dealing with when it comes to this relationship. So how can it do that? I have a lot more we can talk about later if we get into it, but let me just highlight a few areas. One is energy security. Here's a perfect example of a place where Japan is an enormous purchaser of U.S. Energy. It's also an area where Japan is an investor in the United States and in building out energy infrastructure, developing energy resources that are then exported, all part of which are exported to Japan. That is an incredibly, it's helping America be stronger, but it's also benefiting Japan. That's, to me, the kind of goal here. Industrial security, I'm going to call it that now, because I think Japan has had this sense for decades of maintaining an industrial security base. And the reality is that Japan already is an investor in the U.S., but on the import side, it's the U.S. is still typically its number two source of imports, but it's the imbalance is still a focus of attention, the trade imbalance. And so beyond energy and agriculture, which I know Patty will talk about more, Japan's going to be looked at to step up its commitment in this area to help U.S. be stronger. So it can do so through things like, I just saw in the news, I guess it was a month or two ago, Toyota stepping forward and suggesting that it was going to start building cars in the U.S., that it was going to export to Japan and sell in Japan. Maybe for U.S. Steel, now that Nippon Steel has a role, maybe it can be doing the same kind of thing. This is the kind of action and demonstration of commitment to relationship that this administration is looking for. Again, it's not my definition. Just want to emphasize, it is just this is the approach. So, and in technological security, there's a lot more to be added on there. So I have examples and ideas for how some things may work, some things may not work in order for Japan to kind of reorient in part, but also to market itself as being like vitally indispensable. So the reality is that Japan can't decouple or turn away from the United States. It needs to find a way to manage this relationship, and to do so not only because of the importance of the alliance, but also because of the need to avoid being kind of ignored or cut out of really important decisions that the U.S. is making about regional security in Asia, Indo-Pacific region, essentially that could affect Japan. So I think that is the main point I'll make, and I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Michael. Since you mentioned it, let me just footnote one little observation that an economist colleague pointed out to me. All these metrics, right, and measure sort of and defense spending as percentage of GDP is actually a metric that greatly advantages Japan because GDP has been stagnant for 20 years. And so this is not growing. I mean, it's the wrong metric. If you wanted Japan to grow its defense spending, right? Can maybe do it on GNP or GNI or something, or some absolute number. But in any event, you trigger that, and that's a fabulous observation, of course. So Patty, let's move on to food security, which is not something we hear a lot about, and yet it's so important.
Well, thank you so much. I took a ton of notes here. I learned a lot from both of you, and there's a lot here to talk about. And Michael, I just want to say I really like this notion of embedded ally, and I think you should market it. So this is terrific. I look forward to talking about it a little more. I want to make a few remarks today about food security, which we can look at as a slice of economic security. And what I'm about to say builds on work that I've been doing for several years now with Kei Shimizu at University of Pittsburgh. And I'm going to do this from the perspective of food security, which is the flip side of agricultural policy in Japan, and highlight just three sets of observations. First of all, I want to demonstrate, or at least highlight, how Japan's policy space for food security has changed. And I would say in a positive way, it's become more rationalized, much clearer. We'll explain about that in a moment. I also want to say a few things about the importance of trade for food security. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to focus mostly on commodities: rice, wheat, corn, and soybeans. And along the way, I'll look at some of the challenges confronting globalized food security strategies, most of which, as I noted from the outset, are domestic, demographic issues, political issues, but also I'll touch on some of the challenges that Japan faces in competition with China. And if there's a little time, and I might leave this to Q&A if it comes up, Japan's facing an interesting rice crisis right now, which is ongoing, and that really speaks to issues of food security as well. So I'm going to paint with some broad brushstrokes, and I expect I'll raise more questions than I answer, but I guess that's the point of a Zoominar, so we can have a conversation later. So this isn't something we talk about a lot. What is food security? And definitions have changed over the decades. Japan's definitions have certainly changed. But today it embraces an internationally accepted definition that came out in the late 90s by the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization, which argued that food security is achieved when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences. So you can think of two prongs here. To have food security, you need a stable supply. And you also need to guarantee access. People need to be able to get their hands on this food regardless of what's inside their wallets. So in the past, Japan was obsessed with the supply side of food security, and in ways that really helped increase domestic production, but also in ways that privileged farmers and not in ways that can privileged consumers. And this is understandable to a point. No matter how you measure it, Japan has a pretty low food self-sufficiency rate, in fact, one of the world's lowest. We can talk about how they measure that later on in Q&A. But in calorie terms, which is the main measure that Japan uses, it is only 38% self-sufficient in food production, which means it must depend very heavily on imports. But there are other reasons why Japan has long been obsessed with supply, and that's largely political, I think. The farmers in Japan for decades have had enormous electoral power. That has declined in recent years, but still quite significant. And we see it playing out even today in the rice crisis. And that incentivizes government to really play to the interests of producers and in ways that don't always lead to economic efficiency. And the result of all of that has been excessive protectionism for certain sectors, particularly rice, gross market inefficiencies that raise the price of key commodities, particularly rice. And these sorts of structural problems in Japanese agriculture really haunt Japanese food security policy even today. But on a brighter note, I do see, both Kay and I have seen, that the structure of the food security policymaking system has really changed in recent years. And for decades, it used to be addressed simply as an offshoot or a side effect of agricultural policy, centered in the Ministry of Agriculture. But since the 2010s, with the rise of Abe Shinzo, and particularly since 2020, there's been the introduction of new policy frameworks, revisions of laws, introduction of new laws that have created what I would say is a discrete, clearer policy space. And this really mirrors developments in economic security. So as Japan was introducing its Economic Security Promotion Act, it was also very busy, but in a way that wasn't always covered by the media, in creating a similar set of laws and regulations to deal with issues of food security. The Ministry of Agriculture is still at the center of this, although there's more oversight from the Kante. There's a lot more codification of necessary legal terms, including food security concepts and food security goals. There's more effective interagency cooperation and a spate of other supporting laws and regulations, including IP protections for farmers, and so on and so forth. So the system for achieving food security, which is achieved in Japan through domestic production, imports, and stockpiles, is much less informal than it used to be even 10 years ago. And it's more rational, I would say, more based in legal foundations. And that, I think, is a good thing insofar as it makes for clearer policy, more smooth execution of policy in the pursuit of certain strategies for food security. Now, the reasons this has all happened are very similar to why economic security has become such a thing in recent years. Threats to global supply chain disruptions for food relating to pandemics and climate change and war, government budgetary constraints, but also for reasons that are distinctive to agriculture. Japanese agriculture is facing a huge crisis right now with a farm successor shortage and declining domestic demand, and food security strategies are one way to get Japan out of this morass. The problem is that this framework doesn't do enough to address the main structural impediments to achieving food security. And as an example, let me just talk a little bit about one of the major goals of contemporary food security strategies, and that's export promotion. Japan's export of commodities, we're not talking about seafood or pearls or processed foods like beer or sake, but things like rice and vegetables, etc., but I'm going to focus mostly on rice, has been surprisingly weak given the quality of Japanese food. In fact, in 2020, it was estimated that only 2% of total agricultural production was geared to export, and for rice, it's still only about 1%. But it is recognized that producing for foreign demand for Japanese food is increasingly important because it helps compensate for two major drivers behind Japan's agricultural crisis. And the first is declining domestic demand for rice and for other food products. And it also may incentivize more people to enter farming, thus addressing the successor crisis. So under Prime Minister Abe, momentum toward more food exports, including for rice, really picked up, and that has accelerated over the last 5 years. There have been a spate of different measures introduced to achieve this: subsidies for various players in domestic food supply chains, program to create more partnerships between farmers and cooperatives, distributors, ports, trading companies, and tech firms. Ministry officials are now being dispatched to embassies and consulates around the world, particularly in the United States, to create new sources or cultivate demand for Japanese food products and so on. But this has been an uphill battle. The structure of domestic agricultural production within Japan is too heavily fragmented to create the kind of big batch volumes or quantities of exports that would actually result in a profit and make it worthwhile for farmers and other actors in the supply chain. Japanese farmers are just more heavily incentivized historically to produce for regional markets, let alone national markets and even international markets. So it's an uphill battle for Japan to achieve this. And then the other, I think, most important reason why Japan doesn't export much rice is that it's just too expensive. And it's too expensive because of bad policy that's been politically driven. Now, just very quickly, and I know I'm running out of time, I just want to say a little bit about how Japan may be bad at exporting agriculture, but it's been really good at importing agricultural products. In fact, the trading companies, Japan Agricultural Cooperatives, the Zeno division, they've been masterful at bringing into Japan stable supplies of wheat, corn, soybeans, etc., the commodities that Japan cannot produce itself. And that in itself is, I think, a super interesting story. The trading companies from Marubeni and Mitsubishi and Mitsui, and also J.A. Zeno, have been engaged in grain origination in the United States. They own major infrastructural supports for agriculture within the United States, and I know that Mike will be able to speak to this as well. They have taken their cue from major grain traders like Cargill and Louis Dreyfus and ADM to invest in grain elevators and export terminals along coasts. And they're now diversifying into countries in Latin America, doing a fairly good job. Now, I think they did, however, reach their heyday in terms of being purveyors of grain during the 2010s. Now we see a bit of a falling off, and part of that is in part, I think, because of competition from China. So while Japan is beginning to increase its attention to food security, so is China. China wants to reduce its dependence on foreign suppliers of grains, which includes Japanese suppliers of grains. And they're also giving Japanese trading companies a run for their money in grain origination, not in the United States. I don't think China's welcome there quite yet, but certainly in Brazil and Peru and many other countries of Latin America. That is a challenge for food security because Japanese domestic demand is declining so rapidly that Zeno and these trading companies, Mitsubishi and Company, are intent on increasing their supplying of foreign markets, including Eureka in Southeast Asia and certainly in China. But for China, that market seems to be shrinking, and that's posing something of a threat to the bottom line for many of these trading companies. So the future for trading companies in Japan is a little bit uncertain, And that speaks to the import side of food security equations for the Japanese. So lots to say about the rice crisis, but let me stop there. Hopefully it will come up in Q&A. I'm sure lots of people have questions about it. But I think I'll end with on that note about trade since it speaks to the first two presentations. So thank you so much.
Terrific, Patty. Thank you. So, audience, the questions are coming in, and please do feel free to type in your questions, and we'll kind of weave those into our conversation. So, Michael, if I could pose my question that I kind of did in passing to you again. I mean, is this so? What is new? The United States has long changed course from one administration to the other, and we could call it flip-flop or reorientation or whatever a nice term is for that. And Japan has long been quite predictable in how it's conducting its trade negotiations. Is this something we're picking up now that Japan is sort of given that there's a more of a precarity in this moment? Is it just that the U.S. is even less reliable than it used to be, or more flip-flopping, and Japan and China and so forth are more stable, or is this just business as usual, and
Mhm.
we've seen it before?
Well, I think we've seen it, over the past decade, but it's new, and it's, I think even more dramatic than we've seen before, and it is different, of a different character. I really do think that, and I felt that myself in my own position, and in part that was also true in the Biden administration as well. And it's, my firm belief is that so much of the US wanting to change the world order in its new vision, but it's not one vision, it's a competing vision, right? Competing vision between, if the Democrats are in office, it's, a focus on the environment or on its values and its, equity and the rest. And if it's a Trump administration, it's a different agenda, a different set of agenda. It used to be that mutual interest is mutual interest and was always the basis for a conversation. And that's my point, is that kind of the domestic debates that are going on in the U.S. on both sides that have pulled the U.S. in so far in either direction are now kind of reflecting themselves in, and they always have to a certain degree, but even more dramatically in terms of expectations of its trading partners. And you see this very clearly in the nature of what appears to be personal relationships between the president and certain individuals, if they share a worldview. And I think this is where Takaichi in Japan has an advantage in more than not. Then there's a sense of a greater likelihood of getting along, instead of being vilified essentially as part of the other side or the other establishment. So how U.S. domestic politics is being pushed into its foreign relationships, which used to be much more mutual respect. This is what you do, this is what we do. Let's cooperate where we can. We share common values. We may not agree on everything, to kind of an expectation of agreement on my way or the highway, if you will. And this goes back to the sort of zero sum kind of point that I keep trying to repeat, and help people understand why Japan, even such a close ally as Japan, and that relationship is really being tested right now, because of this real shift in orientation and expectation for how U.S. is going to order its relationships. So it is fundamentally. It doesn't mean things like cooperation are impossible. It just means it takes place on a different kind of in a different dimension, and on a different terms, and with different expectations.
I think the other thing that's different is that I was really impressed with the quality of the people and the quality of the strategy making that I encountered. Things are really changing in Japan. I mean, the ministries are, really not what they were 30 years ago, I would
Right. Well,
say.
I think that's right, and I think it's Japan has refound its skill at managing its dependence, interdependence with the world, and that's always been a core part of Japan's strength, but they need it more than ever before, I think, and I think they're on their A game. I think you're right.
So the questions are coming in, and let me start with our colleague Hiroki, who actually has a three-part question. I think it's one for each of us. Um, uh, Given the nature of the Trump administration, I'm reading, very volatile, is it a good thing to have long-term strategies? How should Japan think about flexibility with its long-term stretch? So is Japan flexible enough, I guess? And the second part of the question is how FDI add into the zero-sum context, Michael, that you laid out. FDI by Japan into the US, let's say, should be a win-win for Japan as the investor and the United States, the investee. So there should be no problem as long as everybody wins. So why can we not think about this in win-win? I like this question. And then the last one's for Patty. Is there any way for Japan to stop the Gentan policy? Why did Prime Minister Takaichi nominate a pro-JA, pro-Gentan Minister of Agriculture while she cares about economic security, which should include food security? Wow, brilliant questions. Michael, you wanna jump at that first?
Well, maybe on strategy, maybe you have your. I want to hear from you too, or for all really. But I think Japan's, is it valid to have a long-term strategy? Japan's strategy, I think, is flexibility. I think it is. I think that is the strategy,
Yeah.
and to maintaining enough, yeah, flexibility is not the word I was looking for, but basically to maintain that posture and to be ready, both economically in the security realm. That includes putting your eggs in a lot of baskets, but it means shopping around and having friends, having other friends. And I think we've seen that. We see Takaichi going to. I'm not sure if she personally went to meet with NATO, but I think did meet with a NATO commander. Some things like this, which are to me shine through as obvious signs of how Japan is trying to maintain its diversified relationships and to strengthen those that try and anchor the U.S. How is FDI not zero sum? Well, I'm not talking about my view or maybe how many people see it. And shouldn't it be win-win? I mean, again, I think the point I'm making is that if it's pitched as contributing to the U.S. economic security and to U.S. strength, then I think it comes across that way. If it's pitched as Japan wins and the U.S. wins, it falls flat I'm sorry to say, in this environment as a pitch, as a sales pitch. Yep.
Yeah, I would just add to that. That's why I made such a big deal out of the name of this division, the Kyojinka. Kyojinka is actually it's tenacity, but it also is a flexible thing, right? So it's not resilience in our definition of the word, which is how long does it cover,
Mm-hmm.
does it take to recover from a shock? It's let's prepare so that we're really strong and muscular and whatnot and tough. And then when the thing comes, then we know what to do. And I think that's actually the underlying long-term strategy is, okay, here are our interests, here's what we need to cover. And then we're gonna just go with the flow in terms of how we're gonna get there. I think there's actually quite some flexibility in this long-term thing. But there are a couple of things where Japan will just and I think this has always been true in the trade negotiations. There's a certain flexibility, and then there is sort of a base, and we will not go beyond this. And this is our interest, and if you come here, you'll hit a wall. And we'll be very kind about it and very polite, and then we'll tell you over and over again that you've just hit a wall, and thank you, please go, Yankee, go home. Right? You must have experienced that more often than not, right? So there's a
Mm-hmm.
flexibility above that, but if this threshold is reached, then no more. But the Gentan policy. So, Patty, can you explain for the audience what Hiroki is referring to, and And
Well, hello, Hiroki. I know who you are. Gentan is a policy that should be dead by now, but it's not. And so it translates very clumsily as the rice acreage set aside policy. And it was introduced in 1970 to prop up the price of rice when there was a glut of supply in the market. And what it does is basically pay farmers not to grow rice every year. It's a quota system and a subsidy system. Prime Minister Abe thought it was a very bad idea. He had a lot of support in those beliefs. And he announced shortly after he assumed power the second time that he would abolish it. And in some ways, he did by 2018, but it exists in other ways. The Japanese government is still involved in assessing what demand should be for a particular year or what it would be projected to be, and also in making recommendations for the supply of rice. They also heavily subsidize farmers for producing certain kinds of rice. And right now, the main subsidy is for rice for livestock feed, which is contributing to the rice crisis for consumers today. The way in which the Japanese government has always meddled in the rice sector, the way in which it is doing it is changing. Gentan still exists, and I think it's one of the major impediments to a fully liberalized and more efficient economy.
so,
Or
while
ever.
we're at the agriculture thing, let me just bring a question in here by Akira. Thanks for all of our perspectives. Um, the what is the level of awareness, Akira is wondering, of precariousness of the system constraints? So, for instance, how many days of surplus food is available in Japan if there were a crisis?
Good question. I don't know how many days of surplus food there is, but I do know that one of the Japanese government's main goals for decades has been to stockpile rice in case there is an emergency. And that's been going on for a long time. And the current rice crisis, in which there was a temporary shortage of rice, and now the price of rice has gone way up and it hasn't come down yet. One way in which the government has tried to lower that price is selling the stockpiles that it's had, but it hasn't worked. Japanese are fairly conscious of their potential food insecurity. When I first started thinking about Japan, I used to meet many consumer activists who lived through World War II and food shortages and starvation at the end of World War II and during the occupation were one of the major reasons why they joined women's organizations and the consumer movement. Well, that generation is pretty much gone from the scene now. But there's still, I think, a sensitivity to being an island nation, to being subject to blockades, which happened during World War II. And it's certainly a risk if there's ever a Taiwan contingency. This is getting more and more play in the newspapers. It's also, I think, a big issue for lower income Japanese. And we don't often talk about people not having enough money to buy food. But in Japan, it's becoming a real issue of lower income, often single mother families that basically can't afford to give their kids breakfast. And now all kinds of food banks are cropping up through charitable contributions and government support. So food precarity is certainly an issue that is getting worse, and something that speaks directly to food security and that helps galvanize strategizing on how these issues or how food security should be approached going forward.
I had a reason. I was looking for comparative data between Japan and the US and their OECD data that measure food
Mm.
accessibility. And I wasn't surprised that the US is actually faring pretty poorly on this. But Japan certainly was not a poster child in this regard.
No, and the rate used to
Quite
be really
behind.
low, but it's going
Yeah.
up. You can see
Yeah.
it. It's one of the lower ones amongst the countries in those comparisons, but it's on the rise.
Yeah. All right, so Christina, the very famous trade political economist that we all know, I think this is a question for Michael. In the past, Japan has tried to strengthen multilateral rules against export restrictions from perspective of country dependent on energy and food imports.
Mhm.
Japan has complied with restrictions demanded by the US, but do you see Japan now developing a comprehensive strategy of its own as part of economic security planning? Would Japan use indispensability in an industry for economic coercion? Oh, actually, that's a question for you. Michael, you want to take that, and then I'll
No,
think of
you
something
should. You
smart to
go.
say.
No, go.
Yes. Absolutely. I think that play is being played. And we see this in investments and government support of, but also completely private sector activities in the upstream parts of the supply chain to make things that nobody else can make and that other countries need. And the US has missed that boat. In fact, actually, Japan plays straight into that. Right? So if you think of Apple's business model, they design the iPhone in Cupertino and they sell us the iPhone in these glitzy Apple stores, and everything in between is outsourced from someplace. And this, by the way, was deplored by Andy Grove, the famous Intel CEO in the earlier this century. As early as in 2010, he said Silicon Valley is no longer producing any jobs. We invent these things, and then we outsource the manufacturing of all of this far away. And this, of course, then enabled not just Japan, but South Korea and Taiwan and China to become the assemblers of the world. And so out of that, over the last decade, has developed a strategy to create these indispensabilities, right? And so Japan has very much built that out, and it is creating these dependencies that are now kind of that America would like to bring back with, for example, this investment scheme. Can Japan come back to the US and bring manufacturing and can please show us how to make good steel and please show us how to make a semiconductor? Although Japan is saying, wait a minute, we have to relearn that as well. But Japan is making the materials that go into the semiconductors, right? And the strategy there, I think, is Japan really is dependent very much on digital services. I'll just throw this into the conversation because that's another one of those that goes both ways. So I saw recent data that Japan's trade deficit in energy, of course, is super high, but it's actually now Japan pays more for digital services imports than for energy imports. And with that, I mean Google, AWS,
Yep.
all of the cloud services.
Mm,
In terms of yen that flow out of Japan, that is now a bigger trade deficit
mm,
than energy.
mm.
So why would Japan want to build some data centers for the US in America?
Mhm.
Yes. So Michael, you want to add to that?
Sure. I would just add, I mean, this is where, cooperation is in the reality is that Japan just doesn't have the energy infrastructure and it's just too expensive to do a massive kind of data center operation in Japan. So it is going to be reliant on a place like the United States. So I think that kind of investment on energy and on data centers, coming from Japan is another, one of the things I had on my list is kind of how Japan can positively contribute in a way that feeds this narrative that I tried to describe. I would just add to your point, Ulrike, that Japan. I mean, regardless of what you think about it and why it happened, Japan actually sort of did test drive this point with Korea in like 2019, I guess, when they pulled the export control valve and to for whatever I won't get into the debate over exactly why that happened. I have my own I suspect my own reasons. Um, but honestly, I think after it set off the beginning of a really bad spate of time in in Japan-Korea relations. And I think it wasn't a good look for Japan regionally. And I think it was seen, and it ended up going, potentially to the WTO. And I think that Japan has fostered this image of being a fair trading partner, reliable trading partner, a friend, and a part of the region. And it to me anyway, at least in terms of its reputation in the region, looked quite off from the kind of image Japan is trying to portray as someone you can rely on and someone you can depend on. So I just point that out because I think once they test drove it, it got a little ahead of Japan's intentions on that, and it didn't go so well. That's my sense.
Yeah, so let me just footnote this. I didn't mean starting it, but retaliation or kind of getting this out of chips in a negotiation. And I've actually double checked this now in multiple companies and people. It is true that with the exception of the rare earth materials that go into the silicon wafers, the only country that can actually make an advanced semiconductor with all of the machinery and the materials that go into is Japan.
Not Taiwan?
No, Taiwan does not have the materials, does
Doesn't
not
have the
have the
material. Okay,
photoresist, does not have the machinery. Yes, Taiwan, of course, knows how to make these things really, really
yeah,
well. Right? But that's why, so Taiwan and Japan actually have in really good terms
yeah.
for many, many years, uh, hundreds of years. And that's TSMC is investing big time in Japan, partially to protect that technology should bad things happen, right? But TSMC also is very much reliant on these very high upstream materials from Japan. All right, we can switch maybe a little bit. I got a domestic policy question, so Patty, I think that's for you from David. Can you please comment on how Sanseito is influencing LDP policymaking and therefore impacting economic policy? Is Prime Minister Takaichi's China stance simply theater or long-term posturing?
Oh, wow. Those are good questions. For Sanseito, I'll confess, I have not followed its policies from a broad economic perspective. I am more familiar with what is done on issues of immigration, which falls a little outside of the issue of the focus of our seminar today. But whether or not there's a direct impact of Sanseito on Takaichi's quest to limit the number of people who come into Japan, restrictions on foreign workers, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if it can be proven if there is a direct one, but there's certainly a correlation. And as for Takaichi being just posturing on China, I wonder if this is a reference to some of the comments that she made a while back about a Taiwan contingency and how if there's a threat to Japanese national security, she would be that this would justify a role for the self-defense forces. Um, in that sense, I'm just going to follow this train of thought. In that sense, this is opening up a big can of worms. I do think that she has made a point that's been well known for the last 10 years and that she didn't say anything new. She just happened to, or she didn't reveal anything new. She just happened to articulate it in Parliament. And that has, of course, created one of the biggest diplomatic brouhahas between China and Japan that we've seen in recent years. So I think she's in a very difficult spot right now. And quite frankly, I think personally, I feel that she's standing her ground in a way that is doing her justice. So I'd be fascinated to hear what you both think on that issue as well.
Well, I think doing her certainly she's standing her ground. I think the concern, which kind of goes to my point I made toward the opening, was how firm is that ground
Yeah.
if the U.S. isn't. And I think there's been a lot of focus on the very slow U.S. response to supporting Japan in that particular case. State Department finally did come out and say something, but I think that was really, I mean, substantively, really only after a Chinese jet fighter locked in on a Japanese fighter plane a couple of days ago, and I think finally the U.S. stepped forward and said something. But I think this sense of a softer ground is pervading a lot of the risks that Japan is having to imagine in the coming year. Yep.
Yeah, so we have like the best questions. So this is not really following up on this. Although, oh, okay, yeah, here Daisuke has one that follows, and then I have one about economic growth strategy. But Daisuke wonders, following a recent statement by Prime Minister Takaichi regarding Taiwan, tension with China have intensified. If you were serving as Japan's national security advisor, ah, that's nice. How would you how would you approach this? What's the way out of this?
Oh, I miss Sheila. I wish she were here.
Yeah, we'll have to ask her that when we invite her back. That's right.
Right.
Um, I think the question really is. I mean, she didn't say anything new. And what's interesting is that suddenly there's this new situation. Or if we could bring in somebody from Japan's MOFA to answer that question. But Patty, any advice you would have on this?
Yeah, I want to, I think, piggyback on Michael's point that how Takaichi strategizes on this question moving forward really depends on whether or not the United States has her back, because, as I think he pointed out so well at the beginning of his presentation, defense is everything for Japan, and it's one of the reasons why they're patient on economic security issues. So I think it's very important to be reaching out to the United States and securing just the rearticulation of Article 5 of their security treaty. How far does China have to go before the United States really steps up and supports Japan, expresses its support for Japan? But the fact that it hasn't come right out and said that right now is, I think, indicative of the fact of its perhaps increasing unreliability on this. But time will tell. Uh, but I was really disappointed to hear that those two pandas in Ueno Zoo are going to be sent back to China, and I think that's a huge loss for Japan. And I'm looking forward to when things really calm down and those pandas, they finish their trip and come back.
Candace can come back.
It's
Um,
like what happened at the National Zoo in Washington.
I was going to footnote something that Michael said earlier. So one of the things that I was told when I was talking to various people in Tokyo is that you used the word cooperation and Michael several times in your remarks, and I was told like America wants cooperation, we want collaboration, and we
Mhm.
think that's something different. And I
Mhm.
thought that was very interesting. That
Mhm.
that the US is kind of, oh yeah, we cooperate, and
Mhm.
Japan says no, 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 we're gonna collaborate. And so I guess my advice would be to go to the various people in charge in the US government and explain the difference in more detail and what that means. So Hans has a political economy question, which I think that kind of maybe Michael, I'm looking at you, but Patty, by all means, if you have a sense here. So Takaichi-san has this economic growth strategy, and there are 17 sectors selected. For instance, in innovation, the plan says we need 100 unicorns, which I could go on forever, how that's silly, but hey, it sounds good. It's a KPI that cannot be reached, so why are you setting yourself up for failure? But okay. How will her emphasis, this is Hans' question, how will her emphasis on Japan first affect the policy mix? That's a very nice question. Michael, you want to?
Sure. I mean, well, I mean, in certain ways, Japan has, for a long time, always had a more advanced concept of economic security and has pursued that compared to the United States. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the US is now, in certain ways, not in terms of the method or the approach, but in terms of the thinking, is evolving back closer to something closer to Japan's thinking on the idea of needing to have an industrial base, needing to maintain final production of certain products, managing your interdependence as much as possible, and reducing dependence where you can. And I think that's the theme of agriculture sector as well. And there's a huge cost to that, of course, but there's an important counterweight to that as well. So I guess really what I'm trying to say is I'm setting aside things like immigration and the rest. On the economic front, I think that there are ways in which Japan first and America first can collaborate, in the word that I just used. But that means a more sophisticated interpretation and thinking through and pitch for how it is that can occur in a way that satisfies the needs that both have, political needs that both have, and the objectives that they have. Again, mutual dependence, mutual interest for the sake of mutual dependence and mutual interest is not sufficient, at least in terms of what Washington is seeking. And this is why it's seeking, cooperation on its terms from others. But finding these areas in energy and industrial security and technological security, and even in AI and in rare earths. I mean, rare earths is a perfect example where Japan actually has very little. I mean, it's not going to be able to be a supplier of rare earths, so it doesn't have it's not the obvious choice, but it does have the trading companies. It does have the capital. It does have the motive as well, in line with the United States, to collaborate and invest in projects that many of the companies involved haven't really had the opportunity to do so far. So there are ways in which those two meet, but I think it has to be carefully constructed and presented.
I just piggyback on that a little bit. It's more a side note to Michael's comments. He pointed out that Japan's done quite a bit on economic security, and this is widely known, but it's the first country really to have a comprehensive economic security law. And it's been a model for other countries. I know European countries have been looking to it for inspiration as they develop their own versions of this. But one of the biggest challenges in economic security, which speaks to, I think, the themes of this panel, has been, will securing economic security take place at the expense of market opening? And I think the risk of protectionism is always high in Japan, and it's particularly high for agriculture. But on that note, I'd be very skeptical that we will see uh, a major sort of increase in tariffs or decline in agricultural imports simply because Japan does not, at the current moment, have the capacity to achieve a significantly higher rate of food self-sufficiency. It's struggling to do it. It just can't pull it off, and it won't be able to until there's more significant structural reform in the agricultural sectors.
Now, let me add to that. I've come back to my new pet peeve, Southeast Asia, or my new hobby area. So Fernando actually asks us this question about rare earth. I mentioned rare earth and the semiconductor production, and that with the exception of rare earth, where Japan is looking straight at China and kind of, Japan can actually do a lot of things itself. So yes, so rare earth is actually not rare. It's just that there's a little piece in a lot of earth, and so you have to dig a lot, right? And so, as Fernando points out, there's actually some of that stuff in the bottom of the ocean at Minami Torishima, and there's some in Malaysia. There's some there are places around the world that have this stuff, right? And where we could dig. It's just that China has made the biggest investments in these excavation areas. And Fernando, I would just say yes. Um, uh, Japan is successfully diversifying its sources. At the ASEAN meeting in Kuala Lumpur in October, there were a lot of discussions about how we're all friends. I'll throw in, this was actually a very interesting moment at this conference that I attended in Malaysia. There was a panel on investment opportunities in ASEAN because there was this whole ASEAN theme. And one of the sovereign wealth fund investors from Singapore said, well, ASEAN is right now like the divorced children, like the children of divorced parents. And he's talking about the US and China, the children of divorced parents. And the Malaysian investor kind of said, well, yeah, like, the problem is the children are not talking to each other. And I was asked him, what's Japan in this image? And, is Japan sort of the rich uncle that wants to help all the children? Or is Japan, so, I mean, part of our topic today is regional leadership, right? And I think that that is really happening, that understanding the precarity of whether that's food supply or rare earth or whatever it is, of being solely dependent on like the big players. I think Japan has for a long time now build out a regional strategy to be friends or the rich uncle or whatever the imagery is that you may want to use there. And that's true and I think it's true in food just as much as many of the other things. And one of the ways in which these dependencies have been created is to be really nice. Like, so you sell a lot of Corollas to Indonesia, and then everybody in Indonesia knows that Japanese products are good, and so we're friends, and and you've got all these infrastructure investments and trains and so forth. So there's a lot going on there on the business side in Southeast Asia in terms of investments to precisely manage these or balance these dependencies so that there's a sort of a network of countries that look and maybe they're all sort of children or relatives of the divorced parents. I don't know. So we have
Just a quick addition to that. I've noticed a lot in food security issues, agricultural issues, that Japan is still widely viewed as just a really reliable trade partner. It does what it says it's going to do, and it's predictable. And that will always, I think, be one of its advantages going forward.
yeah, and that would be the card to play in some of the earlier questions. So final question comes from Hiroki, and I think sort of a little bit tongue in cheek, but I like it. I just have to we just have to do this. Team, are you ready? So the question is, what indispensability does the United States have? Agricultural products cannot be indispensable because other countries are producing them. Question mark, maybe a statement. Japan's indispensability comes from these high value added intermediate goods that I've been chatting about, the upstream parts. But what's America's indispensability? And I think it's a perfect way to do a final round of comments here. Um, I'll give you some time to think. I'll just throw in there from a business perspective, obviously the security umbrella, but from a business perspective, just the size of the market, the never disappointing consumer spending in this country. We just have a very high velocity of money. I have a visitor from Japan right now who says he can't believe how much the money turns over. People make money, they spend it, they make money, they spend it. Sometimes they spend it conspicuously. It's just a lot of, what in Japan is called the economic metabolism. And that creates opportunity at a very high speed, including also innovation and so forth. So I think the indispensability for on the US side is Silicon Valley's innovative rigor, and just the size of the market that may fall on hard times pretty soon, but as long as it doesn't, it's important. So maybe I'll give it to Michael, and then Patty can kind of close that out, maybe.
Sure, I'd throw in, I mean, obviously the defense capabilities is just, a critical one. And it's not only capabilities in terms of, strike capabilities or defense capabilities, but also in terms of the equipment. And then to your point, Enrique, also kind of the technology behind all of that and and where that is. It's just, simply, yeah, still way out there, but, always challenged in certain areas. I think that the the role of the U.S. also played. This is where it's starting to change, and this is being the reliability, a reliable advocate for freedom, a reliable advocate for the rules-based system, a reliable advocate for alliances because they are in mutual interest, and that is where the ground is shifting, and it is in the U.S.'s kind of leadership, traditional leadership role that allowed it to define the world for itself, but also define the U.S. through its relationships is shifting, and that is a real challenge for the closest friends.
I totally agree. And you both looked at the big ticket items on U.S. Indispensability. Let me split hairs a little and talk about soybeans. And I would tell you that indispensability depends on U.S. indispensability on soybeans depends on who the buyer is. So China can easily say, we don't want your soybeans anymore because when they purchase those soybeans, they do so simply as a middleman. They buy from American companies. But Japan is heavily sunk. It is into the soybean sector in the United States. So it has, and probably for a long time to come, been most dependent on the United States for its soybeans because it is part of the system that produces it. So I think that question can vary depending on the extent to which Japan is invested in that particular sector of the economy. So I'm not ending up with broad brushstrokes here, but
And
I
my
think that
understanding is that,
soybeans are important.
yeah, no, it's the biggest source of protein for many of the of poor Japanese that
Right, and for livestock, that's the main source for livestock feed, one of them.
All right,
Cow,
I like this. I like to end on the U.S. indispensabilities.
cows, pigs,
Team,
and chickens need soybeans.
team, you've been terrific. We've filled up an hour and a half, although usually we only do 1 hour, but with so many speakers, we wanted to have more time, and the audience has stayed with us all along. Audience, thank you, and thank you for your excellent questions. So, we wish you all a very happy holidays and a break from study and whatnot. And we'll be back on January 13th, which is a Tuesday, with Robbie Feldman, who will share with us his views on what the Japanese economy may look like in 2026. Until then, I wish you, great time between now and then, and Happy New Year and all of that. And thank you, Michael Beeman, and thank you, Patricia McLachlan, for joining me here today on this wonderful conversation.
Thanks for
And
having me, Ulrike.
Great to be here.
always great to see you. So take care, everybody,
Bye.
and
Bye.
goodbye.